In our final map scouting video for the series of mapping whitetails here before the season starts, we're going to map scout a new property, and this time we're only going to map scout it, and then we're going to hunt it this fall with no boots on the ground scouting. So if you guys have watched the last couple videos here in this series, you've seen us map scout 3 small properties and then go in and do boots on the ground scouting. So now the kind of second part of this video series is doing a map scout on a bigger property that we're not going to do any boots on the ground scouting, and then we're just going to go in and hunt it this fall. So this will be the last video in this mapping series besides the hunts that we go on this fall, and we'll reference back to all of these maps and the places that we're going when we hunt them this fall. But this property is a much bigger property, probably 4 or 5 times the amount of land on this piece of public land as those other 3 that we were scouting. So should be an interesting place. Again, it's a marsh habitat that we're talking about. We're still looking for transitions. We're still looking for unique access. Still looking for the buck bedding, of course, and still looking for getting away from that hunting pressure. So we'll start with just how we're going to access this place. Some of this public land in Nebraska, you have to have a special permit to park on portions of it. So that's kind of a limiting factor for some people. Some people aren't going to want to pay that extra $20 to get that permit. So that's one thing that's important to note about this. It's going to be pretty much all water access to get back to some of these places, because there's some of these places that are a half mile, a mile, or maybe more from the parking areas, and you have to walk through all the bedding, a bunch of trees to get back in there. Most hunters aren't going to do that. But if you use water access, 1, it's going to be way quicker, and 2, you can get back to some of these areas that other hunters aren't going, which is going to give you probably higher odds of seeing the deer and the bucks that you want to see. So we'll start right down here, probably pretty close to the parking area, but you still have to use that kayak to get around some of this stuff. So the first thing that we did here is mark those transitions again. That's something that you saw in those other properties that we were scouting. We marked those transitions, and then we went in and walked those transitions when we did boots on the ground scouting. But since we're just going to hunt, we're going to go in with a stand on our back, with our tree saddles. We're going to scout our way along that transition, looking for good sign. If we find good sign along those transitions, then we're going to set up right on those transitions, do an observation set, but also being in an area where you know the bucks are going to travel along those transition areas, and they might also be bedded right there. So again, we're just putting that stand on our back, taking those tree saddles, and we're going to go scout our way in along these transitions that we've picked out on this map. And a lot of times those transition lines, when we set up there, those aren't the places that we're going to probably kill that buck, but it's that starting point. We're going to go in and start along that transition and then move from there once we get information from sign that we see or from the hunts that we go on in those areas. And you can see I marked quite a few on this map. Like I mentioned earlier, we've got one right down here in the bottom that's kind of along this hardwood transition to cedar trees. There's another one, same thing here. We got kind of hardwoods / marshy terrain kind of along these cedar trees. So again, 2 transitions. I'm going to go in, find a spot along both of those transitions, do a hang and hunt, and then let the sign that I see while I'm scouting or while I'm hunting tell me what to do next. If I need to move farther into that transition, stay where I'm at, move to a whole different area. That's what kind of those hang and hunts are for, along those transitions, giving you that starting point. And so I'll just go through and touch on all of these transitions while we're talking about these transitions on this map. The approach is the same to do hang and hunts on these transitions as a starting point. So I'm just going to touch on them so you guys can see these transitions on a map and kind of get a feel for what we're looking for as far as transitions are concerned. So we have another one kind of back in here. This looks like kind of marsh habitat right into some of these hardwoods. It's a good ways away from parking. To get back in there, you're going to have to walk a long ways through bedding, walk through a creek, something that a lot of hunters aren't going to want to do. But if I have that kayak, I can start down here, I can kayak all the way in, follow this creek, get back in here, dock the kayak in there, and then boom, I'm right on that transition. I can walk along it, hang my stand on it, and be ready to hunt instead of walking through all of that stuff to get in there in the morning or in the evening. So again, that's how that kayak and that access allows us to get to some of these areas and get to these transition points. We have a couple more back here, just the same thing. This is a simple kind of hardwood transition to CRP over here on the left side, and then back here, again, CRP to hardwoods, just places that we can go in and hunt. And like I said, there's 7 or 8 to 9 to 10 different transitions within this area. Not all of them are going to be good. Some of them we might get to and be like, man, this transition's not any good, but some of them might be good. But they're just places that we're going to go in and do hanging hunts at. And if you've got any of our map scouts over the past couple months or so, you've noticed that we don't have specific hunt here places, but the transition lines and buck bedding pins kind of act as our hunt here locations. And another thing to notice is this is that marsh habitat again. There's a lot of that in this area that I'll be hunting, but one of these places right here, this pin I marked for buck bedding, and it's a point of trees or a tree line that sticks out into the marsh. Especially on this point, we've got a creek that runs through there, and you've got the marsh habitat. So that point of trees that sticks out into that marsh, that's a good place to look for buck bedding in marsh terrain. So that's somewhere where I can just sneak in and try to set up on that, knowing the wind direction that that buck's going to need. I can sneak in there, set up on that potential buck bedding, and see if a buck gets out, follows that transition line back to me while I'm set up there. So that's just one thing to look for in this marsh terrain, is those lone trees and tree lines that stick out into the marsh. And there's a little marsh that kind of sticks out back here in the hardwood. So it's not the main marsh off that big lake, but it's kind of back in there a little bit. You can see that transition line again. We're gonna pay attention to that, scout around that. Deer like to bed off that. And in marsh terrain, especially when they can't walk out in the middle of that marsh, if there's a good amount of water in there, they're going to walk that transition line, put down a lot of sign right there. So it kind of helps you know and pinpoint where the deer are at in those locations. And while we're talking about buck bedding, we've talked about kind of S-curve buck bedding before in some of our map scouts, but you can see right here, this creek meanders through there a whole lot, and all those little S-curves, there could be potential buck bedding points in there. And that's going to be a little bit harder to pinpoint just going in without scouting. So if you're going in and scouting, that's when you can go to these specific locations and pinpoint those beds. And like I mentioned about those transition lines, some of those beds are going to be good, some of them aren't. There might be beds in some of those locations, there might not be beds in other ones. So it's just going to be, again, potential hang and hunt locations. I can come in either through this creek in the morning and walk up it if it's not very deep and set up on some of this stuff, set up between a couple of them. Like right in here, you got a potential buck bedding spot here, a potential buck bedding spot here. Setting up right in here might be a good area to catch some of those bucks, cover two of those bedding locations, and figure out if there's deer in there. As we move north here along this little portion of this peninsula, again, this spot especially, even more so than that other area we were just looking at, is going to be key for that kayak access, because if you look right here, it's probably a good 1.5 miles, 2 miles from this marsh bedding right here, this transition, to any type of parking, because that's a private house right there. So any hunter that's parking just on the public land all the way up here is not going to get all the way back in here. So that's why I'm going to use that kayak, park right here, make a quick trip out of it, get right up in here to some of this buck bedding. And what we found from scouting those smaller properties is right at the end of that marsh is where we found a lot of that good buck bedding. So again, I'm going to come in, walk this transition line again. Even though there's a house right there, some of this stuff right back in there might be overlooked, might be buck bedding in there. So I'm just going to walk this transition line again and look for buck bedding just like I did in that last map scouting video. Walking that transition, and once I find that sign, slowing down a little bit, and then trying to find where those specific buck beds are. And again, there's a couple of transitions in here. Got this hardwood kind of strip of trees that works its way this way. CRP grass over here that could be good buck bedding, and kind of a cedar tree transition up here to the top. This spot right here with all this CRP grass in that transition, that's a good area to sneak into and do a hang and hunt observation set. Those bucks will bed in that CRP grass, and it's kind of hard to just, from a map, get an idea of where the buck is bedding in that CRP grass. So to come in, do an observation sit somewhere down here, overlook all that, get a pinpoint on where that buck is at, where he's moving, and then move in from there. And we have a couple more of those S-curve bedding areas right here, especially when that water level is down in that lake and it actually is just a creek right there and not just a whole bunch of water. That meandering creek that runs through there creates that S-curve bedding, kind of a little island right in there. That could be some really good bedding. So to go into these spots and hunt, you're just going to have to know what wind or try to figure out what wind you think that buck is going to be bedding in that specific area with. Once you know what that wind might be, then figuring out your setup and setting up correctly for that wind. So if you look at this spot right here, this kind of S-curve, if I think a buck's bedding in there, he's obviously going to be facing this little creek area with the wind blowing from the hardwoods behind him. So I'm going to need some kind of westerly wind for that buck to be bedded there. So since I know that, I know where I can walk without him smelling me to get in there, and I know what way he's going to be facing. So then I can kind of figure out a general location for me to get in there And in a situation like this where I'm going in without any scouting, trying to figure out, what wind the buck's going to be better there on, where I'm going to put my tree stand when I go in, I'm probably going to go in and do a morning hunt instead of an evening hunt, because a morning hunt allows me to get in there without that buck being in there. So you can get away with a little bit more. Morning hunts in situations like this where you haven't done any scouting I think are important, because it allows you to get away with a little bit more. You can get in close to those bedding areas without bumping those bucks out. We have a couple more of those CRP fields right up here as we move a little bit farther north. Again, these areas are really secluded. It's going to be hard for other hunters to get back in there. CRP fields, again, a good area to do an observation set, especially those secluded CRP fields. Do an observation set over those. See if you don't see any deer. See if you see some bucks bedded in there. Even some travel routes or some good trails to know where they're headed when they go into the woods. And for me in general, this whole area right here in the middle is a very good area. If you look at the map, it's really diverse, a good mix of hardwoods and marsh habitat a long ways away from the public access. I don't think hunters are getting in there. Quite a few transitions kind of intermingle and connect right in there. So this area right here in the middle is probably where I'm going to focus on. And that's an area that's going to be hard for most other public land hunters to get to if you're not coming in with kayak access, if you're not using that water access, because there's just no way to get back in there. So there's some specific locations, some potential buck bedding pins in this area, but for the most part, I was just like, this area is where I want to go. So I'm going to go in, try to find what I feel like is a good area when I sneak in there in the morning, set up there, and just let a series of hunts tell me where to move within that big general area. I mean, it's probably at least 3 or 4 acres right in there, if not more than that. So I'm not going to be able to find the exact area just from looking at this map. So I'm going to go in and do several hanging hunts, probably 4, 5, or 6 hanging hunts in this area, different locations, but all within this area to kind of figure this area out. So that's kind of our broad approach to hunting this property. It's a lot larger than those other 3 properties that we were hunting, but the things we're looking for are still the same. We're still looking for potential buck bedding areas. We're still looking for S-curve bedding along creeks. We're still looking at marsh habitat. We're still looking at transitions. The only difference here this time is that we're not going to go in and scout it. So we don't know if these are good areas or bad areas before we go in. So like I said, we're not going to go boots on the ground scouting in this area, but you'll be able to follow along with these areas that we hunt throughout the fall. And that'll wrap up our map scouting series here before we start getting in the woods and hunting. Our season opens here in a couple of days, so we'll have a whole bunch of whitetail hunting content for you. Should be fun, have a bunch of new places that we can go and hunt. Should have a lot of action-packed hunts for you this fall, kind of using that new content strategy where we're filming everything, showing you guys everything on a daily basis. So remember, guys, we have t-shirts. You can follow the link down below, go to the store and check those out if you're thinking about trying to buy some Whitetail Instinct swag and support us a little bit. As always, hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.